Hi, I'm happy to be here and have a chance to talk to people in San Jose. My name is Alison Weir. I'm executive director of a nonprofit organization called If Americans Knew. Our mission is to provide the facts on Israel-Palestine to the general public. We're a nonpartisan organization, really somewhat journalistic, and I'm also president of the Council for the National Interest. That was started, I believe, about 25 years ago to work for policies that would be in the best interests of Americans and really for the world. You know, we all do best if there's peace in the world. Tonight I'll be telling a little bit about my background, and I'll also talk about the book that I've just written about the history of U.S.-Israel relations. When I speak around the country, people often ask how I got involved in this issue, because I'll be focusing on Israel-Palestine and the American connection to it. Most of us, I don't think, know very much about that, especially as in my case, I don't happen to be Jewish or Arab or Muslim or Palestinian. And about 15 years ago, I knew very little about Israel-Palestine. I was the editor of a small newspaper, a weekly newspaper, in Sausalito, California, focusing on the local community. I covered the local school district, the fishing fleet when it came through, the city council. The Middle East seemed distant, confusing, and irrelevant to my daily life. So like most Americans, I would just skim the headlines on that topic, accept the confusion that I found, and move on. We're very busy. There are many important issues to pay attention to, many within our own country. And so because of that, I think most of us have not really focused on Israel-Palestine and don't really know what a major connection we have to this issue. I often like to start out by telling people that we all, as Americans, have a very close connection to Israel-Palestine, because our government gives Israel approximately $10 million per day of our tax money. Per day. $10 million per day. And this has been going on for decades. We have given more to Israel, which is one of the smallest countries on earth, more of our tax money than we've given to any other country on the planet. In fact, an analyst worked out that we give more to Israel, or have given more to Israel, than we have given to all the countries of South America put together. And you can add in the Caribbean, more than we've given to them all together. And we've given more to Israel than we've given to all the starving countries of Africa put together. This makes us very responsible for how Israel uses our money. It also is something that I think we should look into. Is that a good use of our money? Even when we're cutting back on sometimes very important programs for our own citizens, for veterans, for seniors, for people with low income, people in need. We cut back things sometimes because our economy is not doing well and we need to do that perhaps. While we're doing that, we continue to send millions of dollars, really billions of dollars, to Israel, and most of us don't know this. Our politicians don't debate it because there's a very powerful special interest lobby that works on behalf of Israel. There are major campaign donors who donate to both parties on the basis of whether that candidate will continue sending our money to Israel. It's a bizarre situation. It's been going on a long time, but I was never aware of it. So that's our connection to it as Americans. That means that what Israel does, we are responsible for. In many cases, we don't know very well what Israel does because the American media are very Israel-centric in the reporting. Our organization has done some media studies, and we've found that the media consistently cover Israeli deaths at many times greater than they cover Palestinian deaths. I've been now studying this, as I said, probably about 15 years. During that time, Israelis have killed many more Palestinians, including many more Palestinian children than Palestinians have killed Israelis. And yet our media report on very few of the Palestinian deaths, while they report on a very high percentage of Israeli deaths. So as a result, people that pay attention to the news a bit have the impression that Israelis and Israeli children are being killed in large numbers. And some people have the impression that really not very many Palestinians are being killed, or that they were killed afterwards just by Israel defending itself. In reality, every time there's a pause in the violence and then a resumption of violence, it is Israel that resumes violence first and kills Palestinians first. And then eventually, very sadly, Palestinians retaliate, trying to defend their population, and then Israelis die too. As you can see on that chart, the children that were killed first were Palestinians, and the children that were killed in far greater numbers were Palestinian children, all the way through. We've done media studies, as I mentioned. We have some of those statistics. We did a study of the San Jose Mercury News. I think it was about 10 years ago. This was one of our first studies. I don't live in San Jose, but I lived nearby at that point. So we decided to, this was a very typical daily newspaper, the San Jose Mercury News, and we decided to look at their coverage of Israel-Palestine, of deaths among both populations, because it's my feeling that all deaths are tragic, that Israeli deaths are tragic, just as Palestinian deaths are tragic, especially children's deaths. They're all significant, and certainly when children are killed, that's newsworthy. So we looked into how many children among both populations had been killed during that first year of the uprising, because first impressions are so powerful. We discovered, using an Israeli organization, how many children had been killed among both populations. And then we looked at what percentage of those children were covered in front page news stories on the San Jose Mercury News. Many of us are busy and we might just glance at the front page to at least learn what the big news of the day is. We found that for the Mercury News, they had covered Israeli children's deaths in far greater numbers than they had reported on Palestinian children's deaths. In fact, they had reported on 70% of Israeli children who had been killed were on the front page of the Mercury News, 70% of them. Of the Palestinian children who had been killed, and many more Palestinian children had been killed, only a little over 3%, about 3.5% of Palestinian children were on the front page headlines. So basically, the front page of the Mercury News reversed the situation. It made it appear to people that live in the San Jose area, that read the Mercury News and that look at the front page headlines, that many more Israeli children were being killed than Palestinian children, even though it was the reverse, even though many more Palestinian children have been killed during that time period. This is a significant distortion. It's really unacceptable. Journalists won't be perfect. Daily journalism is very hard, so mistakes will be made. That's understandable, and I don't fault people for making mistakes. But a pattern of such distortion is unacceptable journalism, and we should not accept it. But most of us accept it because we don't even know that it's going on. What happened with me is, when I got curious about this issue in fall of 2000, I thought I would just learn about Israel-Palestine by following the news coverage, mainly on NPR, also from the San Francisco Chronicle, since I lived in that area, and the New York Times. As a journalist, when I finally paid attention to this issue, fairly quickly I noticed that we were getting very one-sided coverage, that we would hear about Israelis in great detail, and Palestinians very rarely. Because I wanted the whole story, and I think most Americans want the whole story, I went on the internet to see what I could discover, and I found that there were excellent news sources on the internet from the region itself. Palestinian media that are excellent, Israeli media that are excellent, human rights organizations that are there on the ground reporting day by day exactly what's going on. And when I started to look at those news sources back in fall of 2000, then early 2001, I was shocked at what I discovered. I found that Israeli forces were killing largely unarmed demonstrators, Palestinians, men, women, and children, in large numbers every day. But then I discovered something even more troubling. I read an Israeli report in an Israeli newspaper that said that the strategy that the Israeli military was using was not to kill too many Palestinian civilians, because they were concerned that if they killed too many children and women and civilians, that maybe the world would notice, and maybe we would all do something about it. So their strategy was not to kill too many, but to injure multitudes, because the injuries would be off the radar. Nobody would notice those. So according to this Israeli report from an Israeli newspaper, Israeli soldiers injured over 6,000 men, women, and children in the first month alone. And according to this Israeli report, Israeli snipers and soldiers were specifically targeting knees and eyes. So with that kind of information, and my new awareness that it was my tax money that was enabling that grotesque violence, I began to think this was perhaps the most covered up issue I had ever seen. And we've all seen many. We've seen governmental cover-ups, we've seen corporate cover-ups, we've seen cover-ups by both parties. But I didn't feel that I had ever seen a cover-up of this magnitude that had lasted decades and that spanned the political spectrum ever before. So I began to look into it more and more. And after a few months of learning more and more information, I decided I needed to go over to the region and see for myself if it could be as bad as I had begun to think that perhaps it was. So in early February of 2001, I traveled over to Gaza and the West Bank as a freelance reporter. That was the most unusual trip I've ever undertaken. Many years before, I had been in the Peace Corps in Afghanistan. In that case, I had a very official support system helping and guiding me, the Peace Corps. In this case, I was going to be traveling alone. I had no organization sponsoring me or guiding me whatsoever. And when I landed on February 7th, 2001, I experienced the fear I'd been trying to ignore on that long trip, that long airline flight. What was it going to be like for me as a single female American to wander through a largely Muslim land that was in the middle of a violent uprising, and that was at the epicenter of a region we're continually told is hostile to Americans and to women in particular? What would it be like for me? It was too late to turn back, so I traveled very randomly and haphazardly throughout Gaza, throughout the West Bank, and I found that things were very different than we are led to believe. I saw children who'd been shot. There are many of them. I saw children with bullets in their backs and their stomach. I saw a little boy with a bullet in his head. I saw entire residential neighborhoods that were bullet-riddled. This was in early 2001. This was before a single rocket had been fired from Gaza. Our news media consistently tell us, well, Israel is defending itself from rockets from Gaza. Well, in reality, I saw entire neighborhoods bullet-riddled, some of the buildings in ruins, before a single rocket had been fired. We're also told, well, Israel is defending itself from Hamas. Well, this was several years before Hamas was elected to the leadership of Palestine. It was already in ruins. You know, we're being misled profoundly with what the media are telling us. As I traveled around that area, I also found that people were very welcoming. It was interesting. I always told people I was an American, that I was there to see what was going on, and their invariable response was welcome, even though they were very aware that it was my tax money that Israel was using. People in the Middle East are very aware of how much money and weaponry the U.S. gives to Israel, even though most Americans don't know it. It's widely known in that area. Despite that fact, on that trip, and on my other trips since that time, I have been welcomed. People smile at you. They would welcome me to their homes. Many people invited me to stay in their homes, which I was glad to do. So I saw a population that cherishes their children just the way we do, that was under siege, that already in early 2001 were often finding it difficult, sometimes impossible, to go to the hospital, to go to school, to go to work, to see what was going on, to be able to go to, important things, to deliver a baby, because there were Israeli checkpoints in between. And by checkpoints, I don't mean toll booths. I mean soldiers in combat gear with machine guns. And a number of women have died at these checkpoints, so it's very significant, because they were trying to get to the hospital to deliver the baby. So then there's a stillbirth at the checkpoint, and in some cases, not only does the baby die, but a number of women have died in those circumstances as well. When I came back from that trip, I decided to look into this issue, what the Israel-Palestine conflict is about, how it began, and the American connection to it. And I began to read books 14 years ago. I looked for books that I felt were reliable, that would be factual, that would provide a history of what's gone on. And I discovered that there has been a very, very significant political lobby in our country that has operated for over a century. It's part of a movement called political Zionism. This is not a religious movement. The goal of this movement that began in the late 1800s, it began in Europe, but very quickly there were members of this movement in the United States, was called political Zionism. Its intention was to create a Jewish state in Palestine. A few other locations were considered. Argentina was considered, Uganda was considered, but very quickly they settled on Palestine to create a Jewish state. In the late 1800s, Palestine was fully inhabited. It's an ancient land, and its population was 95% non-Jewish. It was approximately 80% Muslim, about 15% Christian, and a little under 5% Jewish. So this political Zionist movement's intention was to dispossess, to push out 95% of the inhabitants. That's what the creation of Israel was going to entail. What's interesting is that this movement, while it was very active in the United States and in Europe, was not welcomed by the Jewish population in Palestine. They wanted nothing to do with it because Palestine in the late 1800s and the early 1900s was peaceful, as it had been for centuries. All of those groups, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, had lived together for centuries without violence. There are ancient synagogues there, ancient churches. So the violence that we see now did not originate in Palestine. It originated with a very fanatic political movement in Europe and the United States. It was also for many decades not endorsed by Jewish people around the world. Most people opposed it or had nothing to do with it. Americans, Jewish Americans, at that time in the late 1800s and early 1900s for quite a few decades, felt they were Americans, just like anybody else, and they had no interest in moving to the Middle East and living there. So they were not Zionists. The same with Jewish citizens of England. Most said the same thing, that they had no interest in joining the Zionist movement. It was a very minority movement for many decades. Nevertheless, it became quite significant by about 1910. It already had, I believe in 1910, there were about 20,000 Zionists in the United States. It already contained lawyers and businessmen and people of significance. It was already in 1910 becoming a movement to which politicians were listening, especially in the larger cities. And by the way, I ended up writing a book on this. It's called Against Our Better Judgment, The Hidden History of How the U.S. Was Used to Create Israel. You can read it quite quickly, and it's fully cited. Everything that I'm saying here on this show is footnoted in my book. So as I said, by 1910 there were already 20,000 Zionists in the United States. By 1920 I believe there were 200,000, And they were pushing for an agenda that many people were not in favor of. The majority of Americans were not in favor of it, and the State Department was opposed to it. They considered this a movement that had nothing to do with the United States and would be harmful to the United States. So it was not even endorsed by the political establishment of the United States. Then in 1912, there was a very significant occurrence. A prominent Boston attorney named Louis Brandeis became a Zionist and in fact became the head of World Zionism. This was a world movement, and the leadership transferred from Europe to the United States at about 1912 or 1914 with Louis Brandeis, who a few years later, Louis Brandeis was appointed to the Supreme Court by Woodrow Wilson. When he became a member of the Supreme Court, the normal circumstance, the ethical behavior, is that a justice resigns their political affiliations, their board memberships, etc., because they're supposed to be neutral arbiters of justice and not have anything that would be perceived as a conflict of interest. So Louis Brandeis outwardly resigned his leadership of World Zionism, but secretly he continued it. This was written about in a number of books. It's widely known by people that have studied Brandeis. It's just that most of us don't know this. So what Brandeis was doing, his loyal lieutenants, his Zionist associates, would come into his Supreme Court chambers, report on what they had done, on their activities to push the Zionist agenda in the United States, and then Brandeis, in his Supreme Court chambers, would give them directives to go and carry out. I found this shocking behavior. This was shocking behavior because this is completely unethical and improper for a Supreme Court justice to do such a thing. That's why he kept it secret. By the way, one of the people that was one of his loyal lieutenants was a man named Felix Frankfurter. Felix Frankfurter also later went on to become a Supreme Court justice and did the same type of thing himself. So I found this shocking, as I mentioned. I was astonished to learn this fact about a really well-regarded Supreme Court justice, someone I had always respected quite a bit. But then I discovered something even more astonishing about Louis Brandeis, so I'll give you my source for that. What I was doing was, as I mentioned, I was reading as many books on this subject as I could find that I felt were reliable, factual books. And one of the books that I read was called Israel in the Mind of America. It was published by a very mainstream publisher, Knopf, and the author was a very mainstream publisher named Peter Gross. He had been at the New York Times and Harvard University. He was he had written a number of nonfiction books. In his book, he said that and by the way, Gross tilts towards Israel. His book, clearly he tries to be even-handed, but when you know the subject, it's quite clear that he's really closer and very sympathetic towards Israel, far more than to the Palestinians. In his book, he wrote that Louis Brandeis had been the leader of a secret society that had operated in the United States. This society was called the Parashim. They operated to push this Zionist agenda throughout the United States. They would plant ideas and at high levels of government. I was shocked to see that statement from really a very scholarly book and scholarly author and mainstream publisher. So I looked at the footnote, of course, to see where that information came from, and I found that the main source was a scholarly journal, the American Jewish Historical Quarterly. In 1975, had an article that told about the Parashim in detail and told about Louis Brandeis's connection to it and some other people's connection to it. So this is well documented that did exist, that Louis Brandeis was part of it. And by the way, the author of that article was an Israeli scholar named Susan Schmidt, Dr. Schmidt, She's a professor at a mainstream university in Israel. I discovered that they had one of the things that the Parashim had done, one of the leaders, actually the founder, was a man named Horace Callan, who's from the University of Wisconsin. He had planted the idea of what became the Balfour Declaration. In 1915, he had planted that idea, according to, it's well documented by Peter Gross. The Zionist connection to World War I, something I had never heard of before. But again, many books tell about it. The way that something called the Balfour Declaration was achieved. The Balfour Declaration was a letter from Lord Balfour to Lord Rothschild, in which the foreign minister, Lord Balfour, basically said that the British government would look with favor on the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Basically give the go-ahead to the Zionist endeavor to colonize Palestine and to push out Palestinians. Because, it hedged. It said as long as it did not interfere with the rights of the people living there. So it's actually a fairly mild statement, but a very significant one historically. People might wonder, well, why would Lord Balfour say something like that it was issued in 1917. The negotiations began in about 1915. The Palestine was not under the British Empire at that time. It was under the Ottoman Empire. The British had nothing to do with it. Well, it turns out that the reason that the British negotiated for this was because they were in the middle of World War I. They were desperate to win that war. They were losing it at some points. They had 50,000 casualties in one day of battle, in the first day of the Battle of the Somme. The Zionists, especially a man named Chaim Weizmann, who later became the president of Israel, went to the British government and claimed that if Britain would promise to help this Zionist colonization project of Palestine, if the British would promise to do that after they won the war and defeated the Ottoman Empire, because World War I was against the Germans and the Ottoman Empire, that the Zionists, they claimed, would help the British win that war because they would use Louis Brandeis and others to influence the U.S. to enter World War I on the side of Britain. Even though the American public did not want to enter the war, and in fact Woodrow Wilson had won his second term of office with the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." This is called the Gentleman's Agreement. It's discussed and described in a number of books in detail, and that's a connection to World War I had never heard about before.